Imagine standing inside a stone arena barely wider than a city alley, the crowd pressed against elevated platforms on either side of you, the air smelling of rubber and blood and copal incense, your hips already bruised from the last 3 volleys, and the realization descending on you with perfect, soul-crushing finality that losing this game does not mean going home in shame. It means not going home at all. It means a stone knife, a carved altar, and a head that rolls across the court floor, while 7 serpents of blood from your severed neck feed the hungry earth and keep the sun rising tomorrow morning. Welcome to the most consequential sports event in human history, where the stakes were not trophies or championships or even empires, but the continued existence of the cosmos itself, renewed by your blood, kept alive by your sacrifice, ratified by the thud of a heavy rubber ball against ancient stone. If you are watching this from Pakistan, India, the United States, Mexico, the United Kingdom, or anywhere else across this extraordinary planet, I want to see your city in the comments right now. Drop it below, and let's map how far this story is traveling, and if the intersection of ancient sport, cosmic theology, and deadly ritual gets your heart pounding the way it gets mine. Please subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because we are just getting started, and the history we cover here will rearrange everything you thought you knew. Here is a question I want you to think about while you watch. What should our next deep dive be? The Viking raids on the monasteries of Europe, the lost empire of the Mongols, or the dark secret history of the Silk Road? Tell me in the comments, and your vote will shape what comes next. Before the beginning, long before the Aztecs raised their pyramids above the lake city of Tenochtitlan, long before the Maya carved their intricate calendars into limestone stelae in the deep green jungle, long before any empire dared to call itself the master of Mesoamerica and demand tribute in jade and feathers and human hearts, there were people, simple, extraordinary, entirely human people, whose names history has not preserved, and whose faces we can only imagine. Archaeologists call their earliest traces the Archaic period cultures, groups of hunter-gatherers who wandered the dense tropical jungles, the volcanic highlands, the seasonally flooded coastal lowlands, and the arid semi-deserts of what is today Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, moving with the animals and the seasons as far back as 8,000 BCE. And perhaps further still, these were not primitive wanderers stumbling blindly through the wilderness. They were observers of staggering precision. They watched the night sky with an intensity that modern astronomers would respect, mapping the movement of Venus across its 8-year cycle, tracking the lunar nodes, noting the heliacal rising of the Pleiades with a reliability that could only come from generations of meticulous attention and careful record-keeping, transmitted orally across centuries. They noted the seasons with the discipline of people whose lives depended on getting the rains exactly right, on knowing, to within a few days' margin of error, when to plant and when to harvest, and when to move to higher ground before the floods came. They were not primitive. They were scientists without laboratories, astronomers without telescopes, engineers without steel. And when they eventually domesticated maize, that miraculous, world-transforming grain, somewhere around 5000 BCE in the Balsas River Valley, region of what is now the Mexican state of Guerrero, the change they set in motion was as consequential as any single technological development in the entire history of our species. With maize came surplus food. With surplus food came the possibility of sedentary life. With sedentary life came population growth. With population growth came specialization. Some people could now spend their lives thinking and building and creating rather than hunting and foraging. And with specialization came something that had never quite existed before in these jungles in quite this form: civilization. The leisure and the population density and the social complexity that made civilization possible also made something else possible: formal, structured, architecturally embedded, cosmologically charged sport. And at the heart of that sport, from its very earliest emergence, was a rubber ball that its makers did not regard as a toy or a plaything or an instrument of entertainment. The rubber ball, to the people who first shaped it in the steaming lowlands of the Gulf Coast, was nothing less than the heartbeat of the cosmos made physical. The sun and the moon compressed into a sphere of processed tree sap, given to human hands to keep in motion, so that the universe would not stop. Era 1, the Olmec and the birth of the game, 1500 BCE to 400 BCE. The story of the Mesoamerican ballgame begins, as so many of civilization's most dramatic stories do, with a people whose very name is a mystery adopted from their enemies. The Olmec, a word that comes from the Nahuatl language of the Aztec and means roughly rubber people, is not what they called themselves. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know with certainty what language they spoke, what their creation myths described, or even the precise political structure that organized their society. What we know is what they left behind, and what they left behind is sufficient to establish them as one of the most consequential civilizations in the entire history of the Americas. The colossal stone heads, 17 known examples, carved from basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons, quarried from the Tuxtla Mountains, and transported more than 50 miles across swampy lowland terrain without the benefit of wheels, metal tools, or draft animals. Stare out across the tropical Gulf Coast landscape with an expression of absolute, unquestionable authority. Each head is unique. Each head depicts a specific individual wearing a specific helmet that is identifiable in style as a ball player's protective headgear. These are not generic ruler portraits. These are portraits of specific people, each one defined by the particular ball player's helmet that marked his individual identity, which means that the rulers of the Olmec world chose to represent themselves to eternity, not as warriors or priests or merchants, but as ball players. The game was not peripheral to Olmec identity. The game was Olmec identity at its most concentrated and its most powerful. The Olmec civilization crystallized around 1500 BCE along the swampy river deltas of what is now the southern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, in a landscape so lush and so brutally hot and humid that the very air seemed to pulse with a kind of primal, untamed energy. The annual flooding of the Coatzacoalcos, Papalopan, and Tonalá river systems deposited thick layers of extraordinarily fertile alluvial soil across the lowland plains, making this one of the most agriculturally productive environments in the ancient Americas. A population that could manage these river systems efficiently could generate enormous agricultural surpluses, and those surpluses could support an elite class of rulers, priests, artisans, and athletes large enough to organize and direct the construction of monumental architecture on a scale previously unseen in the Americas. The Olmec did exactly this, and the result was San Lorenzo, the first major city of Mesoamerica, built on an engineered plateau that rises approximately 50 feet above the surrounding floodplain, and was shaped entirely by human labor into the platform, on which an urban center of perhaps 10,000 people lived, worked, traded, prayed, and played. Sometime between 1200 and 900 BCE, San Lorenzo was not just the first major city of Mesoamerica. By every measure we can reasonably apply across the chronological and geographic distance separating us from it, it was one of the most sophisticated urban centers anywhere on Earth in 1200 BCE, and the fact that it remains largely unknown to the general public is one of history's most persistent intellectual injustices. It was at San Lorenzo, and within the broader cultural sphere of the early Olmec heartland, that the ballgame first achieved the formal, institutionalized, architecturally embedded status that it would maintain throughout the entire subsequent history of Mesoamerican civilization. The rubber that made the game possible was not a casual discovery, but a sophisticated technological achievement. The Castilla elastica tree, which grows abundantly in the Olmec lowland homeland, produces a milky white latex that dries into a brittle, crumbly substance with limited elasticity, useful, but not the springy, resilient rubber that the game required. Chemical analysis of ancient Olmec rubber artifacts conducted in the 21st century revealed something extraordinary. The Olmec were mixing the raw latex with juice extracted from the morning glory vine, Ipomoea alba, in specific proportions that dramatically increased the rubber's elasticity, tensile strength, and resistance to cracking. The morning glory compound acted as a natural vulcanizing agent, cross-linking the polymer chains in the latex in a way that produced rubber with properties strikingly similar to what Charles Goodyear would develop through his sulfur vulcanization process in 1839 CE. More than 3,000 years after the Olmec had already solved the same problem using entirely different chemistry. The balls they produced were dense, heavy, and remarkably resilient. Examples from later periods that have survived in good condition typically weigh between 4 and 8 pounds and have a diameter of about 8 to 10 inches. And they bounce with a deep, resonant energy that observers consistently find slightly uncanny, as though the weight of the ball gives its movement a kind of deliberate, purposeful quality that a lighter ball would not have. Playing with one of these objects at full athletic speed, striking it with the hip or knee, and attempting to control its direction on the sloping stone surface of a formal court required physical conditioning and technical skill of the highest order. The earliest confirmed formal ball court, yet discovered by archaeologists, was excavated at a site called Paso de la Amada in the Soconusco coastal region of Chiapas, Mexico, and has been dated to approximately 1650 BCE, making it, by current evidence, the oldest purposely built sports facility in the world, older than any Greek stadium or Roman amphitheater by more than 1,000 years. This structure, a long, narrow playing alley approximately 80 meters in length, flanked by raised earthen embankments that provided elevated viewing positions for spectators, establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the ballgame was, from essentially its moment of emergence as a culturally significant practice, a designed, intentional, architecturally planned institution, rather than an improvised street game that eventually acquired formal status. Someone or some group of people with sufficient social authority to mobilize the labor of hundreds or thousands of individuals decided that this game needed a permanent home and built one. That decision, that fundamental choice to invest enormous collective resources in the creation of a dedicated space for the ballgame, tells us more about the game's cultural and religious significance in its earliest period than any amount of subsequent artistic or textual evidence. You do not build a permanent architectural monument for entertainment. You build it for something that matters more than entertainment. You build it for something that the survival of your community depends on. At San Lorenzo itself, multiple ball courts have been identified through a combination of surface survey and subsurface geophysical prospection, and the elaborate stone drainage systems found beneath at least some of them suggest court management practices of considerable engineering sophistication, possibly including deliberate flooding, which would have transformed the playing surface and the ball's behavior in ways that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. What is clear is that the San Lorenzo ballcourt complex was not a marginal feature of the city's architectural program. It was central to it, positioned within the ceremonial core of the urban landscape in a way that placed it in permanent spatial dialogue with the principal temples and elite residential compounds. this spatial arrangement, ball court as part of the sacred civic center, not separated from it in some peripheral zone of athletic infrastructure, would remain the governing principle of ball court architecture in every Mesoamerican civilization for the next 3,000 years. The cosmological framework within which the Olmec ballgame operated was dense, layered, and absolutely saturated with the presence of death. Not death as tragedy, not death as defeat, but death as the engine of renewal, as the price paid to keep the universe in motion, as the sacrifice without which the rain would fail, the corn would not grow, and the sun would stop moving across the sky. The Olmec believed in a universe organized around 3 vertical zones: the heavens above, associated with birds, sun, sky, and the forces of light and order; the middle earth of human existence, with its paradoxical mixture of fertility and destruction; and the underworld below, a watery, dark realm of transformation where the dead journeyed, and from which new life eventually emerged. These 3 zones were in constant dynamic tension, their balance maintained not automatically or permanently, but through the continuous intervention of human ritual practice. The Olmec universe was not self-sustaining. It required maintenance. It required feeding. And what it required feeding on was the most potent substance available to human beings: blood. The ballgame, in this cosmological context, was a ritual mechanism for generating the cosmic currency that kept the universe operational. The sweat and blood of the ball players, shed in the course of the game, was a form of sacrifice, a continuous offering to the forces that held the 3 realms in their necessary relationship. And the ultimate sacrifice, the blood of the defeated player, shed in the ritual conclusion of a major game, was the most powerful offering of all, the act that most directly reenacted the mythological sacrifice through which the current world had been created. The artistic evidence for Olmec ballgame practice is extensive, and, in its most dramatic examples, deeply disturbing to modern sensibilities in ways that it is important to sit with rather than explain away. Carved stone monuments, ceramic figurines, and jade objects from San Lorenzo and the later Olmec center of La Venta, which succeeded San Lorenzo as the primary center of Olmec civilization around 900 BCE, depict ball players in protective gear of considerable technological sophistication: thick padded yokes worn around the hips and waist, protective gloves or wrappings on the hands and forearms, knee and shin pads, and elaborate helmets that combined practical protection with ceremonial symbolism. The yoke was particularly important. A curved, U-shaped device that wrapped around the player's lower torso from hip to hip, providing both protection against the heavy ball's impact and serving as the primary striking surface through which the player directed the ball. Early yokes were made of organic materials: wood, leather, thick cloth padding. But by the period of the later Olmec and their cultural successors, elaborately carved stone versions of the yoke were being produced, objects too heavy to actually wear during athletic play, but designed for use in the ritual and ceremonial performances that accompanied the game. These stone yokes were among the finest sculptural achievements of ancient Mesoamerica, and their iconographic programs, typically featuring supernatural beings, celestial bodies, and transformation imagery, make explicit the cosmological significance that the equipment carried beyond its functional role. Among the most extraordinary artistic statements about the ball game's sacrificial dimension from the Olmec period is the carved stela from La Venta, known as Monument 19, which depicts a figure, possibly a ball player, possibly a deity in the form of a ball player, with a feathered serpent rising behind him and a bowl of blood offerings in front. But even more direct are a series of clay figurines from the Olmec heartland that appear to show decapitated individuals in ball player positions, the severed head nearby, or being held aloft, the neck showing streams of blood rendered in the characteristic Olmec convention of snake-like blood scrolls. The message encoded in these objects is consistent across examples from multiple sites and multiple centuries. The game's ultimate conclusion in the highest stakes ritual contexts was the sacrifice of a player whose severed head became the ball of the next game, or more precisely, whose severed head was identified with the ball being the sun, and the sun being something that must die and be reborn each day in order for life to continue. This was not metaphor. It was not symbolic. It was the literal Olmec account of how the universe functioned, and the men who played the ball game were participants in that functioning, willing or otherwise. La Venta, the second great center of Olmec civilization, reached its peak between 900 and 400 BCE, and represents the fullest flowering of the Olmec cultural tradition before the civilization's collapse and dispersal. Its ceremonial complex, organized along a precise north-south axis, aligned with the setting point of magnetic north, spanning approximately 2 kilometers from end to end, was among the most elaborately planned architectural spaces in the pre-Columbian Americas. The massive earthen pyramid at its northern end, approximately 110 feet tall, and originally faced with colored clay and possibly painted, served as the focal point of a religious complex that included multiple plazas, platform mounds, and the ball court complex positioned within the southern sector of the site. The 4 colossal basalt heads from La Venta, each depicting a specific ruler in a ball player's helmet, each carved from single boulders transported more than 60 miles from the Tuxtla Mountain source, stood guard over this complex with an authority that no subsequent regime of stone-face destruction has entirely managed to diminish. Even defaced, even buried, even displayed today behind museum glass in Villahermosa, they communicate something essential about the Olmec worldview: that the ruler was the ball player, that the ball player was the cosmic hero, and that the cosmic hero was the one who kept the universe running with his body, his skill, his blood, and ultimately his life. Buried beneath La Venta's ball court and ceremonial plazas, archaeologists discovered what they called massive offerings, enormous deposits of serpentine blocks, sometimes arranged in the form of jaguar masks or abstract geometric patterns, buried with extraordinary labor and ceremony, and then covered over never to be seen again by human eyes. These were not gifts to human observers. They were gifts to the earth itself, objects too sacred to be displayed publicly, given instead directly to the underworld realm beneath the court floor, feeding the cosmic powers that the ball game was designed to appease and maintain. The scale of these buried offerings, one deposit alone, required the excavation and refilling of a pit 18 feet deep and 77 feet long. Gives some sense of the extraordinary investment of labor and material wealth that the Olmec were willing to make in service of the ball game's ritual requirements. This was not a civilization that treated its cosmological obligations casually. Yet the Olmec civilization did not survive its own internal contradictions and environmental vulnerabilities. Around 400 BCE, La Venta was deliberately abandoned, and its principal monuments systematically defaced. The colossal heads were buried or mutilated, the stela were toppled, and the elaborate ceremonial complex was left to the jungle's slow reclamation. No single military conquest explains this collapse. The archaeological and paleoecological evidence suggests instead a combination of progressive environmental degradation. The same river systems that had made the Gulf Coast lowlands so extraordinarily productive began to shift course due to tectonic activity and sediment buildup, undermining the agricultural base that had supported the elite ritual economy, and possibly internal political breakdown as the elaborate system of tributary relationships and ritual obligations that sustained Olmec elite power became impossible to maintain under the mounting pressure of ecological stress. The population of the Olmec heartland did not die. It dispersed, moving outward in multiple directions, carrying with them the artistic conventions, the ritual knowledge, the cosmological framework, and above all the ballgame tradition that the Olmec had spent 1,000 years developing and elaborating. Every Mesoamerican civilization that emerged in the wake of the Olmec collapse, the Maya to the south and east, the cultures of the Oaxacan highlands, the Proto-Zapotec, the early cultures of central Mexico, inherited the Olmec template of the ballgame and transformed it in ways that reflected their own specific geographical, political, and theological contexts. The Olmec did not disappear. They became the foundation on which everything that came after was built, and their game, played with the heavy rubber ball that their chemical genius had perfected, became the single most widely shared cultural institution in the entire history of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. With the dispersal of the Olmec, the stage was cleared for something that the Olmec world had never quite achieved: the emergence of truly distinct regional civilizations, each one inheriting the Olmec cultural legacy, while simultaneously developing its own unique version of the ballgame's cosmic drama. And none of them more brilliantly, none of them more enduringly, and none of them with more profound consequences for the subsequent history of the world than the civilization that rose in the jungle lowlands to the south and east of the Olmec heartland, building some of the most extraordinary cities the ancient world ever produced, and developing a relationship to the ballgame that was not merely religious or athletic, but fundamentally philosophical, a complete and coherent theory of human existence, death, and cosmic renewal, expressed through the movement of a rubber ball across stone. Era 2. The preclassic Maya and the mythological foundation. 2000 BCE to 250 CE. The Maya did not appear suddenly from nowhere, with their pyramids already built and their calendar already turning. Like all great civilizations, they accumulated complexity gradually over millennia, building on the agricultural revolution that had given Mesoamerica its first surplus, inheriting from the Olmec the basic cultural template of monumental architecture, elite artistic production, and cosmologically charged ballgame ritual, and developing from these foundations something entirely their own. A civilization of extraordinary intellectual and artistic sophistication, whose achievements in mathematics, astronomy, writing, architecture, and religious philosophy place it among the greatest that human beings have ever produced, and whose relationship to the ballgame was more theologically elaborate, more mythologically rich, and more philosophically coherent than that of any other culture in the ancient Americas. The earliest Maya settlements, small farming villages in the highland and Pacific coastal regions of Guatemala and the Chiapas highlands of Mexico, date to around 2000 BCE. By 500 BCE, something had shifted. Villages were becoming towns, towns were becoming cities, and cities were beginning to compete with each other for resources, prestige, and the divine favor that was understood to be visible in military success, agricultural abundance, and the performance of ritual obligations with appropriate magnificence. And at the center of those ritual obligations, inheriting 300 years of Olmec precedent, and already evolving its own distinct theological interpretation, was the ballgame, the single most important document for understanding the Maya relationship to the ballgame, and through that relationship to the entire question of life, death, and cosmic order. Is the Popol Vuh, the great creation epic of the Kayach Maya of highland Guatemala. The Popol Vuh was preserved in a manuscript written in the Kayach language, using Spanish colonial alphabetic script, sometime around 1554 CE, by indigenous scribes at the town of Santa Cruz Quiché, and it records myths that internal evidence suggests are of very great antiquity, possibly dating back to the preclassic period of Maya civilization and preserving even older mythological traditions that may have roots in the Olmec cultural sphere. The Popol Vuh tells the story of multiple attempts by the divine creative powers to make satisfactory human beings. Attempts that fail repeatedly because the beings created lack the capacity for the kind of devotion and sacrifice that the gods require to sustain their own existence. It is a creation story about mutual obligation. The gods create humans, but humans must sustain the gods through worship and sacrifice. And the mechanism through which this mutual sustenance is most dramatically expressed is the ballgame. The ballgame section of the Popol Vuh begins with the hero twins' father and uncle, Hun Hunahpu and Vucub Hunahpu, who were obsessive and brilliant ball players. They played constantly and with passionate dedication in the court near their home, and the vibrations of their playing, the thud of the ball, the shouts of the players, the cosmic energy released by the game, penetrated down through the layers of the earth into Xibalba, the Maya underworld, where the lords of death heard it and were disturbed by it. The lords of Xibalba, named with magnificent specificity in the Popol Vuh as 1 death and 7 death, the principal lords, along with Scab Stripper, Blood Gatherer, Demon of Pus, Demon of Jaundice, Bone Scepter, Skull Scepter, Trash Master, Stab Master, Wing, and Packstrap, were powerful but capricious beings who resented the vitality and joy of the ballgame being played above them. They dispatched supernatural owls as messengers to summon Hun Hunahpu and Vucub Hunahpu to Xibalba to play. The brothers went, because in the logic of the Popol Vuh, you do not refuse a summons from the lords of death, and they were killed, not through defeat in the ballgame itself, but through a series of trials in which the lords of Xibalba tricked them with mannequins, with darkness, with heat, and with cold. Hun Hunahpu was decapitated, and his head was placed in the fork of a calabash tree by the road to Xibalba as a trophy and a warning. But the severed head of Hun Hunahpu was not merely a trophy. It was a seed. A young woman named Exquick, daughter of one of the Xibalba lords, approached the tree out of curiosity, and the head, speaking to her, spat saliva into her palm, fertilizing her supernaturally with the life force it contained. Exquick became pregnant and fled Xibalba, giving birth on the surface world to twin sons, Hunahpu and Exbalink, the hero twins whose story constitutes the greatest mythological narrative in the pre-Columbian Americas. The hero twins grew up to be the greatest ball players the world had ever seen. Their ball playing, their agility, their intelligence, and their courage exceeded those of any previous mortal. When the lords of Xibalba sent owls to summon them, as they had summoned their father, the hero twins accepted. But unlike their father, they were prepared. They descended into Xibalba with full knowledge of its tricks and traps, and over the course of multiple nights of trials, the House of Cold, the House of Fire, the House of Bats, the House of Razors, They endured and outwitted the lords of death using a combination of athletic skill, supernatural ingenuity, and a willingness to sacrifice themselves temporarily as a tactical choice rather than a defeat. In the House of Bats, the great bat demon Camazotz sliced off Hunapu's head while the twin was sleeping, and the lords of Xibalba gleefully hung his head from the wall of the ball court to use as the ball in the next day's game. But Exbalank, the surviving twin, arranged for a squash carved to look like his brother's head to be placed on his brother's body, and then, during the game, orchestrated a play in which a rabbit raced across the court, drawing the spectators' attention, while the real head was retrieved, reattached, and Hunapu was restored to life. The game continued. The hero twins defeated the lords of Xibalba at their own game. And then, in the narrative's most brilliant move, they demonstrated their ultimate power by dying voluntarily. They invited two Xibalba sorcerers to grind them up and throw their bones in a river. And then they reconstituted themselves, emerging from the river alive and transformed, more powerful than before, having defeated death not by avoiding it, but by passing through it and returning. The lords of Xibalba, unable to achieve the same trick, were defeated and humiliated, and the hero twins ascended into the sky to become the sun and the moon, or, in some versions of the myth, the sun and Venus, where they continue to move through their eternal courses, their ball game continuing in the celestial sphere, the ball still in motion. The game that began in the underworld still being played in the heavens above. This mythology was not bedtime story for the ancient Maya. It was cosmological physics, the literal explanation of how the universe worked, why the sun moved, why the rain came, why corn grew from the earth, and why human beings were obligated to plant it, harvest it, and offer it back to the powers that had provided it. The ball game was the central metaphor and the central mechanism of this cosmological system. And the ball court was the place where the boundary between the human world and the supernatural one was thinnest, most permeable, most charged with the possibility of communication and intervention. Every game played on a formal court was, at some level, a reenactment of the hero twins game in Xibalba. Every player was, at some level, a hero twin, and every sacrifice that concluded a major ritual game was, at some level, the death and transformation of the hero twins. Not a killing, but a cosmic promotion. Not a punishment, but an apotheosis. The sacrificed player ascending to join the company of those whose deaths had kept the universe running. The city of El Mirador in the Petén lowlands of northern Guatemala is the greatest physical monument to the preclassic Maya world's ambition and achievement. By 300 BCE, El Mirador had grown into one of the largest cities in the ancient world, a sprawling urban complex extending across approximately 16 square kilometers, with a central ceremonial core of monumental architecture connected to outlying residential and civic zones by a network of raised causeways called Sakbiab. or white roads, some of them extending for dozens of miles through the jungle to connect El Mirador with neighboring cities in what appears to have been a sophisticated regional urban system. The La Danta pyramid complex at El Mirador, built over multiple construction phases between roughly 600 and 200 BCE, reaches a maximum height of approximately 230 feet and has a total construction volume of approximately 2.8 million cubic meters, larger by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza, making it, by that measure, the largest pyramid on Earth. The Tigray Pyramid Complex is not far behind. These were not simple piles of earth and rubble. They were engineered structures of extraordinary precision, built with a level of organizational and technical sophistication that demands respect regardless of the cultural distance separating us from their builders. And at the heart of El Mirador's ceremonial complex, as at every major Maya center of the Preclassic and Classic periods, stood ball courts, multiple ball courts of varying sizes and with varying architectural relationships to the surrounding ceremonial infrastructure, suggesting a differentiated system of game playing in which different courts hosted games of different ritual significance and different social participation. The largest and most formally constructed courts, positioned within the primary ceremonial precinct and adjacent to the major temple platforms, were presumably reserved for the highest stakes ritual games. The events at which the full cosmological weight of the hero twins' mythology was invoked, at which the cosmic consequences of victory and defeat were most directly in play, and at which the sacrificial conclusion of the game, when it occurred, would have been witnessed by the maximum audience and would have carried the maximum political and theological impact. Smaller courts in less ceremonially prominent positions may have hosted practice sessions, training games for younger or less experienced players, or community-level games with lower ritual stakes, but no less athletic intensity. The ceramic and sculptural record of the Preclassic Maya period documents the ballgame with increasing sophistication and detail as the period advances. Figurines depicting ball players in protective gear appear at sites across the Maya lowlands from at least the Middle Preclassic period, roughly 1000 to 400 BCE, and they become progressively more elaborate and anatomically detailed as the centuries advance, reflecting both improving artistic technique and the increasing cultural importance of the game as an institution. By the late Preclassic period, between 400 BCE and 250 CE, ball player figurines and ballgame-related ceramic vessels were among the most commonly produced luxury objects in the Maya world, distributed widely through the trade networks that connected Maya cities across the lowland region. The protective equipment depicted in these figurines, yokes, pads, helmets, gloves, is consistent with descriptions of the game from later, better documented periods, and the body postures and physical types of the figurines suggest artists who were working from close, direct observation of actual game playing, rather than from stylistic convention alone. These were people who had watched the game and who were trying to capture something specific and real about how it looked and felt. The Maya also contributed to the ball game tradition, something that no other Mesoamerican culture developed to the same degree of complexity, a calendrical system of extraordinary mathematical sophistication that embedded the game within a cosmic schedule of ritual obligation, so precise and so astronomically grounded that it elevated the ball game from a periodically performed religious event into a continuous, omnipresent feature of the cultural landscape. The Maya calendar was not one calendar, but several interlocking cycles operating simultaneously. The Teotihuacan, a 260-day ritual calendar, whose origin probably reflects the approximate length of human gestation, consisted of 20-day names cycling through 13 numbers in a pattern that repeated every 260 days, creating 260 unique day-date combinations, each carrying specific augural and ritual significance. The Hob, a 365-day solar calendar of 18 months of 20 days each, plus a 5-day, nameless period of extreme ritual danger, tracked the solar year with impressive accuracy. The combination of the Teotihuacan and Hob created the calendar round, a 52-year cycle that was the fundamental unit of historical time for most Mesoamerican civilizations. And the Maya long count, a linear count of days extending back to a mythological creation date equivalent to August 11, 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar, allowed Maya scribes and astronomers to place specific historical events within a temporal framework of enormous depth, connecting the present moment to the mythological deep past and projecting astronomical cycles into the distant future with an accuracy that continues to impress modern scholars. Within this elaborate temporal framework, specific ballgame events were scheduled on days whose calendrical significance aligned with the cosmic purposes of the game. A game intended to reenact the hero twins' confrontation with the Lords of Death would be scheduled on a day whose Teotihuacan name was associated with the underworld or with the death deity. A game intended to celebrate a military victory and ritually process the captured enemy ruler would be scheduled on a day whose auguries favored the display of royal power and the humiliation of enemies. A game whose sacrificial conclusion was intended to nourish the corn deity in preparation for planting would be scheduled to coincide with the beginning of the agricultural calendar. The ball game was not played when people felt like playing. It was played when the cosmos told them to, on dates chosen with the combined precision of astronomer, theologian, and politician, which, in the Maya world, were very often the same person. Yet the preclassic Maya world demonstrates, with heartbreaking clarity, the fundamental fragility of even the most sophisticated civilizational achievements. Around 150 CE, El Mirador, that vast, extraordinary, world-class city, began to die. The population declined precipitously. The construction of new monuments ceased. The complex networks of trade and tributary relationship that had sustained the city's enormous population began to unravel. The jungle, which had been held back for centuries by the labor of tens of thousands of people, cutting, burning, draining, and managing the surrounding landscape, began its slow, patient, inexorable reclamation. The causes of El Mirador's collapse were multiple and interconnected. Extended drought, documented in paleoecological records taken from lake sediment cores, struck at a system that was already under severe environmental stress from deforestation and soil exhaustion caused by intensive agricultural production. Political fragmentation among the city's elite factions, visible in the archaeological record as a sudden cessation of collaborative monument construction, and a pattern of localized fortification suggesting internal conflict, may have disrupted the administrative systems that managed water storage and agricultural organization, and possibly disease, spreading through a densely packed urban population with limited sanitation infrastructure, added biological pressure to the system's already strained social and ecological foundations. El Mirador fell silent, and the jungle swallowed it so completely that its very existence was not confirmed by modern archaeologists until aerial survey work in the 1970s revealed the massive vegetation-covered mounds that were its ruined pyramids. It was not the end of the Maya. It was not even, in retrospect, a major interruption. But it was a reminder written in stone and jungle and silence that the cosmic obligations the ballgame was designed to fulfill could not always be satisfied, no matter how grand the city, how skilled the players, or how much blood was spilled on the altar. It was at this moment that the center of Maya cultural and political life shifted eastward and southward, deeper into the limestone lowlands of the Petén Basin and the river valleys of the Usumacinta drainage. And the world prepared itself for the most spectacular, the most intellectually sophisticated, and the most artistically brilliant flowering of Maya civilization that history would ever record. Era 3. The classic Maya and the divine kings of the Ballcort, 250 CE to 900 CE, the classic period of Maya civilization, stretching from approximately 250 CE to 900 CE, is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire history of our species. During these 6.5 centuries, Maya civilization achieved levels of cultural, intellectual, and artistic sophistication that stand comparison with any civilization the ancient world produced. The Maya developed a fully phonetic writing system capable of recording any utterance in their language with complete grammatical fidelity. One of only 5 fully independent writing systems ever developed by human beings. the others being Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphic, Chinese logographic, and the still undeciphered Indus Valley script, their mathematical system, which included the concept of zero as an independently functioning number rather than merely a placeholder. An intellectual achievement that the ancient Greeks, Romans, and most early civilizations failed to accomplish. Enabled astronomical calculations of extraordinary precision. Their astronomical observatories tracked the movements of Venus, the moon, and the sun with an accuracy that matches modern calculations to within minutes of arc. Their architectural achievements, the soaring, corbelled, vaulted temples of Tikal, Palenque, Uxmal, and Kapan, built without metal tools, without the true arch, and without draft animals, embody a command of space, proportion, and symbolic program that architects today approach with something approaching awe. And at the absolute center of classic Maya civilization, architecturally, theologically, politically, socially, and economically, stood the ballgame, Cainish Janop Pakal of Palenque, known to history as Pakal the Great, ascended to the throne of his magnificent jungle city-state on July 29, 615 CE, at the age of 12 years, and ruled for 68 years until his death in 683 CE at the age of 80. One of the longest documented reigns in recorded human history, the city of Palenque, nestled in the foothills of the Chiapas Highlands, where the Sierra Madre del Sur descends toward the Gulf Coast lowlands, was one of the architectural jewels of the classic Maya world. Its palace complex, its trio of temples on the cross group, its aqueduct system that channeled the Achalam River beneath the city center, and above all its temple of the inscriptions, represented the highest achievements of classic Maya architecture and sculptural art. The Temple of the Inscriptions was built by Pakal himself as his mortuary monument, a 9-tiered pyramid corresponding to the 9 levels of the Maya underworld, within whose base a vaulted burial chamber was constructed to receive his remains. His sarcophagus lid, carved from a single block of limestone weighing approximately 5 tons, and depicting the king at the moment of death, is among the most analyzed single objects in the history of pre-Columbian art, and its iconographic program is an extraordinarily dense statement of Maya cosmological belief. Pakal is shown falling backward into the jaws of the earth monster, the mouth of Xibalba, the underworld, while simultaneously the branches of the cosmic world tree rise behind him, and a celestial bird perches at its crown. He is dying, and he is being reborn. He is falling, and he is ascending. He is losing the game, and he is winning it. The ball game metaphor is not explicitly invoked in the carving's imagery, but it is structurally present in every aspect of its cosmological logic. The death of the ruler as a cosmic game, the underworld as the court where the game is played, the resurrection as the triumph of the hero twin principle over the lords of death. The ball court at Palenque is relatively modest in scale. It measures approximately 35 meters in length, but its position within the site's ceremonial core, directly south of the great palace complex, gives it a prominence that its physical dimensions alone would not suggest. Pakal and his successors clearly understood the ball court as an integral component of the royal ceremonial landscape, not a peripheral facility, but a central one. And the inscriptions and sculptural programs associated with the court make clear its role in the demonstration and maintenance of royal authority. The court at Pelunk was the setting for the ritual games that accompanied major calendrical events, the turning of important calendar round periods, the anniversaries of royal accessions and deaths, the commemoration of military victories, and the ritual processing of captive enemies. It was a theater of power as much as an athletic facility, and the performances staged within it were carefully choreographed to communicate specific political messages to the assembled court and populace. The ball court at Capan, the great classic Maya city of western Honduras, offers a more elaborate and better documented example of ball court architecture and iconographic programming in the classic period. The Capan ball court was rebuilt multiple times over the city's dynastic history, each reconstruction adding new layers of architectural refinement and symbolic content. The final version of the court, constructed around 738 CE during the reign of the king Uxaklajun Abakayawil, he of the 18 images of the lightning god, known in modern scholarship as 18 Rabbit, is the most elaborately decorated ball court in the entire Maya lowland region, and one of the masterpieces of classic Maya architectural sculpture. Its sloping playing walls are studded at regular intervals with large stone heads of the Macaw deity, each head serving as a scoring marker, a point on the playing field where the ball's position relative to the marker determined specific scoring outcomes according to game rules now only partially understood. The court's floor is marked with 3 large stone markers, each carved in relief with images of ball players. And these markers served both as spatial dividers of the playing field and as cosmological reference points, connecting the game's physical space to its mythological dimensions. 18 Rabbit himself, the ruler under whose patronage this magnificent court was built, is one of the most artistically celebrated individuals in the classic Maya world. The stele he commissioned for Capan's main plaza between 695 and 738 CE are among the most accomplished portrait sculptures in the history of pre-Columbian art, depicting a ruler whose physical confidence, divine authority, and elaborate costume radiate from the stone with an immediacy that 14 centuries of tropical weathering have not entirely diminished. Several of these stele show 18 Rabbit in the costume of a ball player, or more precisely, in the hybrid costume of a ruler who has taken on the identity of a ball player, as part of the demonstration of his divine authority. The ruler as ballplayer was a statement of cosmic legitimacy in the classic Maya world. The king's body, trained and equipped for the game, was the body that the hero twin mythology required to keep the cosmic machinery running. A king who could not play, or rather, a king who did not perform the ritual of playing, was a king whose claim to divine mandate was incomplete, whose cosmological obligations were unfulfilled, whose subjects had grounds for doubt about the efficacy of his intercession with the supernatural powers that controlled rain, harvest, and the general welfare of the community. 18 Rabbits' reign ended in 738 CE when he was captured by the forces of Quirigua, a previously subordinate Maya city under the authority of Capan, whose ruler Caoc Sky ambushed and captured him. The capture of an enemy ruler was, in the classic Maya political and ritual system, the greatest possible achievement, more significant than territorial conquest, more meaningful than economic victory, more cosmically powerful than any other military outcome. The captured ruler would be held, humiliated, forced to participate in the sacrificial ballgame ritual in his captor's court, playing the role of the defeated lord of Xibalba to his captor's victorious hero twin, and then sacrificed in a ceremony that validated the captor's authority before both his own people and the supernatural audience of gods and ancestors. On May 3, 738 CE, 18 Rabbit was decapitated at Quirigua by Caoc Sky. His severed head, the ballgame logic suggests, serving as the ultimate ball in the ultimate game. The city of Capan mourned, recovered, and continued to produce extraordinary art and architecture for another century and a half. But the trauma of its most celebrated ruler's capture and sacrifice left marks in its political and artistic record that scholars can still read today. The painted ceramic tradition of the classic Maya period provides some of the most vivid and direct visual documentation of the ballgame's ritual dimensions that survives from the ancient Americas. The polychrome pottery of the Maya heartland, produced in elite workshops at cities including Nakbay, Naranjo, and various sites in the Petane, was among the most sophisticated ceramic art of the ancient world, employing a painting technique of extraordinary fluency to depict mythological scenes, court life, and ritual activities with a narrative specificity and artistic quality that rivals anything produced in the ancient Mediterranean. Many of the finest classic Maya ceramic vessels depict scenes from the Popol Vuh mythology. The hero twins in the underworld, confronting the lords of death across a ball court. The resurrection of Hun-Hunapu from the corn plant, the descent of the soul into Xibalba through the ball court's underworld portal. But they also depict, with uncomfortable directness, the sacrificial conclusion of historical games, captured rulers kneeling before their captors, stone knives raised, heads already severed or about to be. blood flowing in the characteristic serpentine streams of Maya iconographic convention. These images appeared on vessels used in elite funerary contexts, placed with the dead as grave goods, meaning that they were designed to accompany the deceased on their own journey through the underworld that mirrored the hero twins' mythological trials. The message was theologically coherent and practically explicit. The death you are about to experience as a human being is the same death that the ballgame enacts, and the hero twins' victory is the model for your own resurrection. The scale of the ballgame's architectural presence in the classic Maya world becomes most dramatically apparent when we consider the sheer number and distribution of ball courts across the region. Archaeologists have identified more than 1,300 ball courts at sites across Mesoamerica, and the overwhelming majority of these are in the Maya lowlands and the culturally Maya-influenced areas of the Guatemalan highlands and the Oaxacan coast. At sites of moderate to large size, cities with populations of between 10,000 and 50,000 at their peak, 1 to 3 ball courts per site is typical. At major regional centers with populations above 50,000, multiple courts are the rule. The site of Cantona in the Puebla Highlands of central Mexico, a city of perhaps 90,000 inhabitants at its estimated peak population, around 600 CE, has been confirmed through archaeological survey to contain at least 24 ball courts, the largest number known at any single site in the ancient Americas. This figure alone is sufficient to refute any interpretation of the ballgame as an occasional ceremonial event. At Cantona, and by extension at the other major Mesoamerican urban centers with multiple courts, the game was a continuous, daily, multi-venue feature of urban life, an institution as structurally embedded in the city's fabric as the market, the temple, and the palace. But the classic Maya world, for all its extraordinary brilliance and cultural richness, harbored within its most fundamental structural assumptions the seeds of a catastrophic breakdown, the ecological basis of Maya civilization. The intensive maize agriculture practiced on soils that were productive, but not inexhaustibly so, sustained by a system of water management that required large-scale cooperative maintenance, was being pushed to its limits by a population that had grown steadily throughout the classic period. The competitive warfare between city-states that the ballgame ritual was partly designed to channel and control was consuming resources that might otherwise have gone into agricultural investment and environmental management. And then, beginning around 800 CE and accelerating through the first decades of the 9th century, the climate of the southern Maya lowlands shifted decisively toward extended drought, a shift documented with extraordinary precision in the sediment records of lake cores from sites across the region, showing a series of multi-year droughts of increasing severity between roughly 810 and 910 CE that struck at a system already under severe stress. One by one, the great cities of the southern lowlands fell silent. The carving of dated royal stele, that most visible public expression of classic Maya political authority and divine legitimacy, ceased at city after city. Tikal's last stela was carved in 869 CE. Kapan's last dated monument was erected in 822 CE. The final long count date recorded on any classic Maya stela was inscribed at Tanana in Chiapas on January 18, 909 CE, and it recorded nothing of triumph. The jungle moved in. The ball courts were abandoned. The heavy rubber balls rotted. The stone rings stood empty against a sky that no longer seemed to be answering. However, the story of the Mesoamerican ballgame was far from finished. From the north and west, across the highlands of central Mexico, a new power had been growing for centuries. A city so vast, so thoroughly organized, and so commercially and militarily dominant that its influence had already penetrated the classic Maya world even at its peak, and whose legacy would shape every subsequent Mesoamerican civilization in ways that are only now being fully appreciated. The fall of the classic Maya southern centers created a cultural and political vacuum into which this northern power's influence would flow. And the ballgame, ever adaptable, ever essential, would evolve once again into new forms that reflected the new political and theological realities of post-classic Mesoamerica. Era 4, Teotihuacan and the Imperial Game, 100 BCE to 650 CE. Teotihuacan is a city that defies easy comprehension even after a century of intensive archaeological investigation. And the discomfort of that incomprehension is one of the most intellectually honest responses available to anyone who studies it carefully. Standing in the Valley of Mexico at an elevation of more than 7,000 feet above sea level, surrounded on multiple sides by volcanic mountains that create a natural bowl of enclosed highland landscape, Teotihuacan grew from a modest settlement of perhaps a few thousand people in the 1st century BCE into one of the largest cities on Earth by 400 CE, with a population estimated by different scholars at between 125,000 and 200,000 individuals. A range of uncertainty that reflects the genuine difficulty of counting the inhabitants of a city dead for 15 centuries, but whose lower bound alone makes Teotihuacan larger than contemporary Rome, and larger than any other city in the Western Hemisphere by several orders of magnitude. The city was organized along a precisely planned orthogonal grid, oriented to a specific astronomical alignment. Its main axis, the Avenue of the Dead, runs at 15.5 degrees east of true north, an orientation that aligns with the setting point of the Pleiades star cluster on the dates that this cluster crossed the zenith, as well as with various solar and lunar alignments that recur on dates of calendrical significance. This was not accidental. A city of 200,000 people is not laid out on a random angle. The builders of Teotihuacan embedded their city's physical orientation into a cosmic framework that structured every spatial relationship within it. Every street, every building, every courtyard, every drainage channel runs at the same angle or perpendicular to it. And the result is an urban environment that functions spatially and symbolically as a three-dimensional map of the cosmos. The Pyramid of the Sun, Teotihuacan's largest single monument, positioned on the east side of the Avenue of the Dead, at the city's geographic and symbolic midpoint, has a base that covers nearly 10 acres and rises approximately 216 feet in 5 terrace stages to a summit platform that originally supported a now vanished temple. Its construction volume, estimated at approximately 1 million cubic meters of fill material, places it among the largest architectural structures ever built by human hands. And the labor required for its construction, carried out without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or draft animals, represents an organizational and logistical achievement of staggering scale. Directly beneath the pyramid, a natural cave tunnel approximately 100 meters long was modified and expanded by the city's early builders. And this tunnel, identified as a cosmological axis connecting the human world above to the underworld below, was the likely original sacred focus that determined the pyramid's location. A ball court positioned at the western terminus of this tunnel complex would have completed the cosmological triad of sky, earth, and underworld in the most direct architectural terms available. The question of who built Teotihuacan, what ethnic group, what linguistic community, what dynastic tradition, remains one of the most intensely debated issues in Mesoamerican archaeology. And the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. The city's apparent script, if it was a script rather than a purely symbolic notation system, has not been deciphered. The language or languages spoken in the city are unknown. The political structure, whether it was governed by a single hereditary ruler, a council of elites, a priestly college, a militaristic oligarchy, or some combination of these, cannot be determined from the available evidence with the confidence that textual decipherment has given us for Maya dynastic politics. What we do know is that Teotihuacan's political ideology deliberately obscured individual royal identity in a way that stands in stark contrast to the Maya tradition of individualized royal portraiture, where Maya stelae show specific rulers with specific names and specific life histories recorded in hieroglyphic texts. Teotihuacan's murals show elaborately costumed figures who appear to represent offices or roles rather than individual people. The jaguar warrior, the feathered serpent, the storm god's representative, without the individualizing features that would allow us to identify them as specific historical persons. One partial exception to this pattern of anonymous collective rule was revealed beginning in 2003, when a team of archaeologists led by Sergio Gomez Chavez discovered a water-filled tunnel directly beneath the temple of the feathered serpent. Teotihuacan's most elaborately decorated pyramid, located at the southern end of the Avenue of the Dead, and began the painstaking process of excavation that is still ongoing. The tunnel, sealed approximately 1800 years ago, contained rich ritual deposits, and at its terminus, what appears to be a royal burial complex of extraordinary significance. Around the tunnel's root and in associated burial pits, the remains of more than 200 sacrificed individuals were found, arranged with great precision in groups that appear to reflect military formations, victims killed and arranged as a kind of permanent symbolic army accompanying their ruler into the afterlife. Among the objects associated with these burials were items directly connected to the ballgame. Miniature rubber balls still preserved by the tunnel's anaerobic conditions, small stone objects in the shape of ballgame equipment, and pyrite mirrors used in ballgame-associated divination rituals. The presence of ballgame objects in the most exclusive and powerful ritual deposit yet found at Teotihuacan confirms that even in this city, where the game's architectural profile was lower than in the Maya world, it remained an essential element of the highest level ritual economy. The great achievement of Teotihuacan in the history of the Mesoamerican ballgame was not the game itself, which the city practiced in its own modified form, but the creation of a pan-Mesoamerican commercial and cultural network of unprecedented scale that spread the ballgame, along with all its associated artistic conventions, cosmological ideas, and political meanings, to every corner of the region and beyond. Teotihuacan obsidian, the black volcanic glass of extraordinary sharpness that was the primary cutting and scraping tool of pre-metal Mesoamerica, was mined at the Pachuca and Otumba source areas near the city and traded across a network extending from the American Southwest to lower Central America, a distribution range that makes Teotihuacan obsidian the most widely traded commodity in the pre-Columbian Americas. Wherever Teotihuacan obsidian went, Teotihuacan cultural ideas went with it, including the ballgames, iconographic, and ritual conventions. At Caminaljuyu in the Guatemalan highlands, archaeologists found tombs in the 2nd century CE containing Teotihuacan-style ceramic vessels, Teotihuacan-style architecture, and Teotihuacan-style ballgame equipment. Evidence of a Teotihuacan political and commercial presence powerful enough to reshape the local elite's material culture in its own image. Most dramatically, Teotihuacan's military and political influence directly intervened in the dynamics of the classic Maya heartland around 378 CE, when the arrival of an armed embassy from Teotihuacan led by the man known in Maya inscriptions as Xibalba, meaning fire is born, at the great lowland Maya city of Tikal, coincided with the death of Tikal's ruling king, Chaktok-Ikok, Jaguar Paw, on the same day. Whether Jaguar Paw died in battle against Xibalba's forces or was displaced through political machination, the result was clear. Tikal's ancient dynasty was replaced by a new ruling line with strong Teotihuacan affiliations, as Xibalba installed Yak's Noon Ahian, first crocodile, the son of a Teotihuacan ruler, as Tikal's new king. The ball court at Tikal continued to be used, and the new rulers combined Teotihuacan-style political imagery with inherited Maya ballgame ritual, creating a hybrid royal ideology that served simultaneously as a statement of Teotihuacan political legitimacy and a reassurance to the Maya population that the cosmic obligations of the ballgame were still being fulfilled. The game, in this sense, served as cultural bridge and political glue simultaneously, a shared institution that different civilizations could use as a common language, even when they disagreed about everything else. Teotihuacan's own urban destruction around 550 CE, the deliberate burning of its ceremonial core, the systematic defacing of its elite monuments, and the subsequent rapid population decline, remains one of the great historical mysteries of the ancient Americas. The fire that consumed the Avenue of the Dead's great palaces was not accidental. The pattern of destruction, concentrated in the ceremonial and elite residential zones, while many apartment compounds in the city's residential outskirts survived relatively intact, points to an internal uprising against the ruling class rather than an external conquest. Though external military pressure may have created the conditions that made internal revolt possible, whatever the precise mechanism, the result was catastrophic and final. Teotihuacan's political system collapsed, and the city that had structured Mesoamerican political and commercial life for 5 centuries ceased to function as a dominant power. Almost overnight, on the geological timescale of civilizational history, the population, which had reached its peak of 200,000 in the 5th century, declined to perhaps 30,000 by the 8th century. The Avenue of the Dead was still walked. The Pyramid of the Sun was still visible. But the city was a ghost of its former self, a monument to lost greatness that subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations visited in reverence and awe, calling it Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods, because they could not imagine that mere human beings could have built it. This instability in the political vacuum left by Teotihuacan's collapse continued throughout the 6th and 7th centuries, as the cultures of central Mexico struggled to organize themselves into new political configurations, capable of projecting the kind of regional authority that Teotihuacan had exercised. Then, from the northwest, where the desert-adapted Chichimec peoples had long maintained a relationship of tension and occasional violence with the more settled agricultural civilizations of central Mexico. New cultural forces began to move southward, militarized, mobile, hungry, and about to transform the Mesoamerican world once more. Era 5. The Toltec and the Warrior Game, 700 CE to 1150 CE. The Toltec occupy a uniquely ambiguous position in the study of Mesoamerican civilization, straddling the boundary between documented history and foundational myth in ways that make them simultaneously fascinating and methodologically challenging for modern scholars. The Aztecs, who came after them and who spoke of them with a reverence bordering on theological awe, described the Toltec world with the kind of superlative elaboration that typically signals the retrospective glorification of a mythologized golden age. Toltec artisans were said to have invented all the crafts. Toltec farmers grew cotton that bloomed already colored in red and yellow and blue. Toltec architects built palaces of jade and turquoise and featherwork of transcendent beauty. And the Toltec ruler Acatl Quetzalcoatl presided over this paradise with the piety of a saint and the wisdom of a philosopher. This was myth. But in Mesoamerica, as we have repeatedly seen, myth and history were not opposites. Myth was history's interpretive framework, the template through which actual events were organized, understood, and communicated across generations. And behind the Aztec mythologization of the Toltec world there lay a real city, real people, and real historical processes whose consequences shaped Mesoamerican civilization for centuries. The historical Toltec were a culturally complex, politically aggressive, and militarily formidable society that emerged from the ethnic and cultural mixing of northern semi-nomadic Chichimec groups and the remnant populations of the Teotihuacan cultural sphere in the centuries following that city's collapse. Their capital, Tula-Cicacatitlan, located in the modern Mexican state of Hidalgo, approximately 85 kilometers north of Mexico City, reached a population of perhaps 60,000 at its height between 900 and 1,100 CE, with an urban area of approximately 14 square kilometers, organized around a ceremonial core of temples, ball courts, and colonnaded halls that displayed a martial aesthetic dramatically different from Teotihuacan's more refined and cosmologically subtle architectural program. At Tula, the dominant artistic motif was the warrior. Massive stone columns in the form of armored warriors supported the roof of the principal temple. Low-relief carvings on the temple platforms depicted processions of jaguars, coyotes, and eagles, the warrior orders of Toltec military society, consuming human hearts. Chacmols, reclining stone figures, with bowls on their stomachs designed to receive the hearts and blood of sacrificial victims, stood at the entrance to the main temple. This was a society that wore its cosmological requirements on its architecture's sleeve, making explicit what Teotihuacan had kept more ambiguous, that the maintenance of the universe required blood, lots of blood, and that the primary mechanism for obtaining that blood was warfare, and that warfare was conducted by warriors who were simultaneously military professionals and cosmic functionaries, the engines of the sacrificial economy that kept the sun in motion. The ruler sea, a cattle toppled sin Quetzalcoatl, whose name translates as one reed, he who is the feathered serpent, and who ruled Tula in the late 9th or early 10th century CE, is one of the most mythologically resonant figures in the entire Mesoamerican tradition, a historical king who was absorbed so completely into the mythology of the feathered serpent deity that separating the man from the god has proved essentially impossible. The traditions recorded after the Spanish conquest describe him as a ruler of extraordinary piety and wisdom, who opposed the sacrifice of human beings, insisting that the gods could be adequately nourished with offerings of flowers, butterflies, and the blood of small animals rather than the blood of human hearts. His opponents in Tula, who believed that human sacrifice was both theologically necessary and politically indispensable, because the warrior capture of sacrificial victims was the primary mechanism of political competition and elite status display in Toltec society, eventually orchestrated his downfall through a series of supernatural tricks attributed in the mythology to the sorcerer deity Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror, humiliated by a magical mirror that showed him his own ugly face, and then intoxicated with pulque wine by his enemies into committing an incestuous act with his sister. See, a cattle toppled sin Quetzalcoatl was shamed beyond recovery and led his followers out of Tula eastward to the Gulf Coast, where he either immolated himself on a great funeral pyre and transformed into the morning star, or sailed away across the ocean on a raft of serpents, promising to return from the east in the year Cattle, one reed, on the Aztec calendar. This promise of return, echoing across the centuries, embedded in the Nahuatl cosmic consciousness, was still alive in 1519 CE, when a fleet of strange ships appeared on the eastern horizon, and the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II, aware that the year was Cattle in the calendar cycle, was confronted with a question that the entire edifice of his civilization's cosmological system was not equipped to answer without catastrophic consequences. But it was not in the highlands of central Mexico that the Toltec cultural tradition produced its most spectacular and its most brutal expression of the Ballgames' sacrificial dimensions. Around 900 CE, the northern Maya lowlands were transformed by a massive influx of cultural and possibly political and military influence from central Mexico, associated with the Toltec sphere. The city of Chichen Itzá in the Yucatan Peninsula, already an important Maya center with deep roots in the local late classic tradition, was rebuilt and expanded into something qualitatively different from any Maya city that had preceded it, a hybrid architectural and ideological complex that combined the vocabulary of classic Maya architectural form with the iconographic content of Toltec warrior culture, creating what some scholars have called a world city, a site whose deliberately cosmopolitan character was designed to project power across multiple cultural boundaries simultaneously. And at the very heart of this hybrid city, its most prominent and most architecturally overwhelming monument, stood the Great Ball Court, a structure so far beyond the scale of any previous ball court in the Americas that it demands to be treated as a category of architectural achievement unto itself. The Great Ball Court of Chichén Itzá was constructed between approximately 900 and 1000 CE, with possible additional construction phases extending somewhat later. It measures 168 meters in length and 70 meters in width, with vertical stone walls rising 8.2 meters on either side of the playing alley, and continuing another several meters above that in a cornice and decorative frieze. The playing surface itself is not level, but slightly sloped toward the center, creating a specific ball bouncing dynamic that players must have spent years learning to exploit. 2 stone rings, each approximately 60 centimeters in interior diameter, are mounted on the side walls 6 meters above the playing surface, so high that even a tall player standing directly beneath them could not reach the ring with an outstretched arm. Passing the heavy rubber ball through this ring in the appropriate direction was an instant victory condition that also apparently gave the scoring player the right to claim the clothing and possessions of spectators in the immediate vicinity of the point of passage. A social inversion of extraordinary drama, the cosmic moment at which the normal rules of status and property were briefly suspended in recognition of the superhuman achievement that had been demonstrated. The court's acoustic properties, as previously described, were deliberately engineered to allow communication across the full 168-meter length of the playing alley at a whisper, a feature that, in a religious context, would have signified the direct communication of divine voices through the medium of the sacred space. The players at each end of the court could hear each other breathe. They could hear the prayers murmured by their opponents. They were, in the most literal architectural sense, connected to each other through the court's body in a way that players outside its walls were not. The stone panels carved on the lower walls of the Great Ball Court represent the most explicit and the most artistically powerful visual statement about the ball game's sacrificial dimensions in the entire archaeological record of the ancient Americas. These panels, 6 on each long wall and 1 at each end, depict a single extended narrative that runs continuously along both sides of the court, showing the preparation for the game itself, and its sacrificial conclusion with a visual clarity that requires no interpretive annotation. The central scene of each long walls panel sequence shows the moment of decapitation. A player kneels on the right side of the composition, his head already severed, and from the stump of his neck flow 7 streams of blood in the form of serpents, 6 smaller serpents and 1 larger one. And from the mouth of each blood serpent grows a flowering plant or vine. The player's severed head rests on the ground between the 2 main figures, and the standing player to the left of the decapitated figure holds a stone knife in one hand and what may be the severed head in the other. The ball, inscribed with a skull death's head, floats in the air between them. The symbolism is explicit and precise. The blood of the sacrificed player is not loss, but gift, not tragedy, but transformation, not punishment, but cosmic function. 7 streams of blood become 7 flowering plants. The death of one person becomes the life of the earth. The severed head becomes the ball continues to roll, and the game continues. The identity of the person being decapitated in these panels, whether loser or winner, captive or volunteer, designated sacrificial player, or randomly determined victim, has been debated for decades, and the honest answer is that the evidence supports multiple possibilities simultaneously, which may itself be the most accurate interpretation. The ballgame's sacrificial logic, as documented across multiple Mesoamerican cultures and time periods, was not simple enough to be reduced to a single rule of the loser dies. The cosmological framework required the most perfect player, the one whose body and skill most fully embodied the hero twin ideal, to be the sacrifice, because only the most perfect offering was adequate to the cosmic purpose. In some contexts, this was the loser, the player whose imperfect performance demonstrated insufficient cosmic alignment. In other contexts, perhaps more theologically sophisticated ones, it was the winner, the player whose extraordinary performance had proven him the most worthy vessel for divine transformation, the most fitting offering to powers that required the best and not the worst of what human flesh could produce. Both possibilities are documented in the historical and mythological sources, and the attempt to resolve them into a single universal rule reflects the desire for neat answers rather than the complexity of the actual tradition. Yet even the Toltec world, with all its martial power and all its elaborate machinery of sacrifice and cosmic maintenance, could not maintain its dominance indefinitely. Around 1150 CE, Teotihuacan was burned and systematically dismantled in a destruction event that closely mirrors the earlier destruction of Teotihuacan, concentrated in the ceremonial core, targeting elite architecture, suggesting internal uprising, external invasion, or both. The city's population dispersed across central Mexico, and with them dispersed the Toltec cultural tradition, the warrior ideology, the sacrificial economy. The ballgame in its most explicitly militarized and sacrificial form, spreading across the region and seeding the cultural conditions that would eventually produce the most powerful, the most territorially extensive, and the most bureaucratically sophisticated empire in the history of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Then, from the northwest, walking out of a desert whose hardships their own later mythology would describe as a divine purification lasting more than a century, came the people who called themselves the Mexica, and whom the world would learn to call the Aztecs. And in their hands, the ball game would reach its most elaborate, its most politically charged, and its most industrially scaled expression. Era 6. The Aztec Empire and the Industrialized Game. 1325 CE to 1521 CE. The Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico as what their neighbors considered to be the most despised kind of people, landless, kinless, propertyless migrants from the desert north, whose only assets were their absolute conviction that their tribal war deity, Huitzilopochtli, had promised them an empire, and their willingness to do whatever it took to collect on that promise. In 1325 CE, following a migration that their own founding mythology described as lasting more than 100 years, and passing through dozens of resting places, the Mexica settled on a small island in the shallow, brackish waters of Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico, a location that more established groups had rejected precisely because it was so inhospitable, and began the construction of the city that would eventually become Tenochtitlan, the greatest metropolis in the Western Hemisphere. The island had no stone, no timber, no agricultural land, no fresh water, and no political allies. It had reed beds, fish, waterfowl, and the fierce determination of a people who believed, with absolute theological conviction, that this swampy, unpromising place was the center of the universe, and the location where they were destined to build a civilization that the gods themselves had commissioned. Within 2 centuries, they had done exactly that, and Tenochtitlan stood in 1500 CE as a city of approximately 300,000 people, larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than any European city of the period, connected to the mainland by 3 great stone causeways wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast, served by a network of canals, navigated by thousands of canoes, fed by floating garden platforms called chinempas that turned the lake's shallow margins into one of the most productive agricultural systems ever devised, and crowned at its center by a ceremonial precinct whose monuments, including the Templo Mayor, the Ball Court Complex, the Skull Rack, and dozens of subsidiary temples and palaces, expressed in architectural form the cosmological vision that the Aztec state embodied and enforced. The Aztec ruler Ahuitzotl, who reigned from 1486 to 1502 CE, brought the Triple Alliance Empire, the Confederation of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, that is conventionally called the Aztec Empire, to its greatest territorial and demographic extent expanding Aztec control through a campaign of relentless military conquest across a tribute network stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, from the Valley of Mexico to the boundaries of the Maya world in what is now Guatemala. Ahuitzotl was a military commander of genius and a ritual specialist of equal dedication. And his most famous achievement in both domains was the dedication of the newly expanded Templo Mayor in 1487 CE, an event that contemporary sources describe as the largest single ritual event in Aztec history, involving the sacrifice of captured warriors from across the empire in numbers that colonial period accounts place as high as 80,400 over 4 days, though modern scholars debate these figures intensely, with estimates ranging from 4,000 at the conservative end to the full colonial number at the extreme. Whatever the actual count, the dedication ceremony was unprecedented in scale, and the ball game played in the courts adjacent to the Templo Mayor complex in the days preceding and following the dedication was an integral component of the ceremony's cosmological program. The cosmic physics of the rubber ball's motion, providing the foundational metaphor of solar movement within which the mass sacrifice made theological sense. The Aztec conceptualization of the ball game, the tilachli, played in the tilachco, was the most fully articulated and most explicitly documented version of the game's cosmological significance in the entire Mesoamerican tradition, precisely because the Aztec world was the one that Spanish colonial observers encountered and recorded in greatest detail before its destruction made first-hand observation impossible. Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled between the 1540s and 1570s, through systematic interviews with Nahua elders who had lived and participated in the pre-conquest culture, devotes substantial attention to the ball game, its rules, its equipment, its ritual protocols, its social context, and its cosmological meanings. And what the elders described was a game and a cultural institution of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary seriousness. The rubber ball, the uli, named for the rubber plant that produced it, was the sun. The court was the cosmos. The two end zones represented the east and west horizons, the places where the sun rose and set. The rings were the pathways of the sun and moon across the sky. The underground drains beneath the court floor were the entry points to Mictlan, the Aztec underworld. And the players were the mediators between the visible and invisible worlds, the human beings whose athletic skill and ritual dedication kept the cosmic ball in motion and prevented the catastrophic stillness that would mean the end of everything. The specific rules of the Aztec ball game, as recorded by Sahagun's informants, specified a ball of solid rubber approximately 8 to 10 inches in diameter, weighing 8 to 9 pounds, that players could strike only with the hip, knee, and elbow. The hands and feet were strictly forbidden as striking surfaces. This constraint was not arbitrary. It reflected the cosmic identification of the hip, in particular, as the primary locus of human physical power, and the body part most directly associated with the ball game's mythological and cosmological significance. The hip strike required the player to drop to one knee, or sometimes to fully dive across the court floor, in order to position the striking surface correctly relative to the ball, movements that required extraordinary flexibility, explosive leg strength, and a willingness to absorb the heavy ball's impact with body parts that would inevitably bruise, swell, and sometimes bleed from the repeated contact. Sahagun's informants described the bruising with matter-of-fact specificity that suggests direct experience. The skin broken, the underlying tissue damaged, the hip bones sometimes cracked by a ball that struck at an unfortunate angle. This was contact sport in the most literal and physically consequential sense, and the physical condition required to play it at a high level was the result of years of dedicated training that the elite professional players maintained as a full-time occupation. The social and economic ecosystem surrounding the Aztec ballgame was as elaborate as the game itself. Professional ball players, maintained by noble patrons as household retainers, given the best food and the finest equipment, trained from childhood by experienced coaches, and taken on campaigns with their noble patrons as a form of living prestige display, occupied a recognized social niche somewhere between slave and honored dependent. They were valuable properties, quite literally. The gambling that surrounded major ball games involved enormous sums of wealth, and the players themselves were sometimes wagered, their services committed to the service of the winning bettor for specified periods if their patron's side lost. Aztec nobles gambled on the ballgame with an intensity that early Spanish observers found simultaneously fascinating and appalling, betting not just gold and jade and featherwork and cacao, but sometimes their own freedom, their own families, and in the most extreme cases their own bodies, committing themselves to slavery if their side failed to win. The 16th century Dominican friar Diego Duran, describing the gambling culture of the Aztec ballgame with unmistakable astonishment, recorded instances of nobles who had lost everything: house, lands, dependents, jewels, on a single game, and who then wagered their own persons and lost those too, becoming the property of their creditors through the mechanism of a ball struck by a hip in a stone court. The ball game was, in this economic dimension, a wealth redistribution mechanism of extraordinary scale and a driver of commercial activity that extended well beyond the courts themselves into the markets where game equipment, player services, and betting credit were all traded with the fervency of a financial market. The famous legendary game between the Aztec ruler Moctezuma I and Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco, which appears in multiple colonial period sources with varying details but consistent core content, captures something essential about the Aztec understanding of the ball game as political oracle. According to these accounts, the two rulers wagered the fate of their respective cities on the outcome of a ball game. Moctezuma, betting that the Aztec people would someday be driven from the land, and dispersed Nezahualcoatl betting on their permanent establishment and dominance. Nezahualcoatl won the game, and the historical outcome, the Aztec Empire's eventual rise to regional dominance, was retrospectively understood as the cosmic validation of Nezahualcoatl's prescience. Whether or not this specific game occurred as described, the story's survival and circulation in Aztec historical tradition reveals the cosmological logic at work. The ruler whose body is most perfectly aligned with divine favor wins the game, and the game's outcome is therefore a reliable oracle of cosmic intention, more trustworthy than any divination technique that does not involve the full commitment of the human body to the test of physical truth. The Spanish arrival in Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519 CE, disrupted the Aztec world's ballgame culture in ways that played out over years rather than instantaneously. Cortés and his men had watched ball games in various contexts during their march across Mexico, and had been uniformly struck by the physical skill of the players and the strange, heavy, bouncing quality of the rubber ball. An object unlike anything European technology had produced. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the soldier and memoirist who accompanied Cortés and later wrote the most detailed first-hand account of the conquest, described watching a ball game at Tenochtitlan with a combination of athletic admiration and theological horror that perfectly captures the Spanish dilemma in the face of Aztec culture. The game was magnificent. Its purposes were, in the Spanish Catholic framework, diabolical. When Tenochtitlan fell after the siege of 1521 CE, a military operation of extraordinary brutality in which the city was starved, bombarded by cannon fire, and ultimately destroyed by building in weeks of street fighting. The ballcourt complex adjacent to the Templo Mayor was among the structures that suffered physical destruction, and the ritual specialists and professional players who had maintained its operations were among the casualties of conquest and epidemic disease that eliminated perhaps half or more of Tenochtitlan's population in the years immediately following the Spanish victory. The industrialized game, played in the imperial capital with professional players, enormous gambling stakes, cosmic theological significance, and the institutional support of the most powerful state in the Western Hemisphere, died with the state that had sustained it. But the game itself survived, as it always had, in the bodies and the memories of the people who had played it since childhood, and it would prove more durable than the empire that had built its greatest monuments. Era 7, the colonial encounter, and the attempted destruction of the game. 1521 CE to 1800 CE, the Spanish missionaries and colonial administrators who inherited the ruins of the Aztec Empire and the still living Maya cities of the Yucatan Peninsula confronted in the ball game and its cultural apparatus something that their entire intellectual and theological formation had not prepared them to understand or to contextualize. There was nothing in medieval Spanish experience, no analogous institution, no comparable cultural practice that could serve as a reference point for what they were observing. The formal athletic competition played in stone courts with heavy rubber balls by highly trained professionals in a cosmological context that explicitly linked the game's outcome to the maintenance of the universe and the movement of the sun was not merely foreign. It was, in the framework of 16th century Spanish Catholic theology, impossible, because the cosmological system it presupposed was, by definition, false, which meant that the human sacrifices it motivated were, by definition, murders committed in service of demons. The missionaries' response to the ball game was therefore not curiosity, but condemnation. And not condemnation alone, but active suppression. The attempt, pursued with the resources of colonial administrative power, to eliminate from the fabric of indigenous culture the institution that most explicitly embodied the theological framework the missionaries were dedicated to destroying. Friar Diego de Landa, who became the first bishop of Yucatan, and whose ambivalent legacy as both the principal destroyer and the principal preserver of written Maya cultural knowledge makes him one of history's most genuinely complicated figures, conducted the auto de fe of Mani on July 12, 1562 CE, in which 27 Maya codices, bark paper screenfold books of hieroglyphic text and painted imagery, along with approximately 5,000 cult images and 197 large ceramic vessels, were burned in a single ceremony of cultural annihilation. The codices destroyed at Mani included, almost certainly, ball game ritual texts, astronomical calendars used to schedule games, mythological narratives related to the hero twins and the cosmic significance of the game, and theological commentaries on the relationship between specific game outcomes and divine will. Only 4 Maya codices are known to have survived the entire colonial period: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the recently confirmed Grolier Codex. And while these 4 books contain some information relevant to the ball game, the cultural loss represented by the destruction of the others is immeasurable. De Landa, to his credit in this specific respect, was later tormented by what he had done, and the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán that he wrote partly in expiation, describing Maya culture, religion, writing, and daily life in remarkable detail, based on his own observations and interviews with surviving informants, is one of our most valuable sources for understanding the pre-conquest Maya world. The irony is perfect and terrible. The man who burned the books wrote the best surviving account of what they contained. Yet, Delanda's fires, like all the colonial suppression efforts that followed them, discovered the fundamental law of cultural resistance. You can burn texts, but you cannot burn memory. And memory, sustained in the bodies of people who had played the game since childhood, encoded in the oral traditions that transmitted cosmological knowledge from generation to generation, preserved in the underground practice of communities far from colonial administrative centers, proved more durable than any stone monument. The ball game continued to be played across Mesoamerica throughout the colonial period, in forms that ranged from the relatively open to the genuinely clandestine, depending on the specific colonial context and the degree of missionary surveillance in any given community. In the highlands of Oaxaca, a variant called pelota mixteca was played openly in the plazas of indigenous communities, using a large solid rubber ball struck by a hand guard studded with metal nails, and generating community gatherings of several hundred to several thousand spectators that the colonial authorities were simply unable to effectively prohibit, given the game's obvious integration into local social life. In the Sierra Tarahumara of Chihuahua, the Tarahumara people played Rarajipuri, the long-distance ball race in which teams kicked wooden balls across dozens of miles of mountainous terrain over the course of a full day or longer. A game that preserves, in its most basic structure, the idea of the ball as a sacred object in motion through a landscape, understood as cosmologically significant, requiring human physical effort to keep it moving through the world toward its destination. The Jesuit polymath José de Acosta, writing in his 1590 Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, after direct observation of indigenous ball playing in Peru and Mexico, provided one of the most sympathetically attentive colonial accounts of the ball game and its cultural context, noting with admirable scientific precision the remarkable properties of the rubber ball. Its density, its elasticity, its ability to bounce higher and with more energy than any ball made of European materials, and describing the player's physical condition and technical skill with a specificity that suggests genuine appreciation rather than merely clinical observation. Acosta was the first European writer to correctly identify the rubber ball as a product of tree sap, and to speculate about the chemical process by which the sap was transformed into the dense, resilient material of the game ball. Speculation that was not confirmed scientifically until the 19th century's investigation of natural rubber chemistry. His admiration for the game's athleticism was evident and real, and the gap between this evident admiration and his theological obligation to condemn the religious framework that gave the game its cultural meaning creates one of the most interesting tensions in the colonial literature on pre-Columbian culture. The colonial period's engagement with the ballgame's legacy, also produced unexpected material consequences that shaped the modern world in ways that most people are entirely unaware of. The rubber technology that the Olmec had pioneered and that Mesoamerican cultures had refined over 3 millennia was encountered by European observers in the 16th century as an extraordinary novelty, a material with properties unlike anything in the European chemical repertoire, whose most obvious application to European eyes was the making of watertight clothing and containers. Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage to the Americas in 1493-1496, had observed ball games in the Caribbean and brought rubber balls back to Spain as curiosities. By the mid-16th century, small amounts of rubber were being imported to Europe and used for waterproofing purposes, but the material's full commercial potential was not realized until the 19th century's development of vulcanization by Goodyear in 1839, which was, as we have noted, essentially the independent rediscovery of the technology that Mesoamerican cultures had used since at least 1600 BCE. The automobile industry, the medical equipment industry, the aerospace industry, the countless consumer products that depend on elastic rubber compounds, all of them descend in a direct and unbroken technological lineage from the Olmec ball player's discovery that mixing latex with morning glory juice made a better ball. The game that killed people in the service of the sun also, eventually, put tires on cars and gloves on surgeons' hands. Then, from the ferment of colonial rebellion, Enlightenment ideology, and the desperate search for a national identity that could unite a deeply fractured post-colonial society, the intellectual and political movement of Mexican nationalism began to construct a new relationship to the pre-Columbian past, one that would transform the ballgame from a condemned pagan practice into a celebrated symbol of indigenous cultural achievement, and that would drive the archaeological recovery of the game's history with a passion and institutional commitment that has not yet exhausted its momentum. Era 8, independence, nationalism, and the rediscovery of the game. 1800 CE to 1950 CE, the Mexican War of Independence, a decade of catastrophic, multi-sided civil conflict that began with the Grito de Dolores, Miguel Hidalgo's famous cry for rebellion on September 16, 1810 CE, and concluded with formal independence on September 27, 1821 CE, created a political and cultural crisis that would preoccupy Mexican statesmen and intellectuals for the next century. How do you build a coherent national identity for a country whose population includes mestizo people of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, fully indigenous communities in hundreds of distinct linguistic and cultural traditions, and a Creole elite of Spanish descent who have lived in Mexico for generations? but who defined their cultural identity through reference to Spain. The answer, worked out imperfectly and passionately through the 19th and early 20th centuries, was indigenismo, the ideology that placed the pre-Columbian indigenous heritage of Mexico at the foundation of national identity, celebrating the Aztec and Maya civilizations as the authentic ancestral tradition of the Mexican people, the source of a cultural pride and a historical depth that could balance and counterweigh the European colonial legacy. Within this ideological framework, the Mesoamerican ballgame occupied a significant symbolic position. It was the sport of the ancestors, the athletic tradition of the civilization that had built the Templo Mayor and the Temple of the Inscriptions, the physical practice that connected the bodies of modern Mexicans to the bodies of the people who had, in the indigenous narrative, created the first, and in some ways, the greatest civilization in the Americas. John Lloyd Stevens, the American lawyer and diplomat, whose 2-volume Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, published in 1841 CE, introduced the ruins of Maya civilization to the educated reading public of the English-speaking world, was the first popular writer to describe the ball courts of the Maya cities in detail, accessible to a non-specialist audience. Stevens and his English artist partner, Frederick Catherwood, visited the ball court at Capon, the ball court at Uxmal, and the great ball court at Chichen Itza during their 1839–1840 expedition, and Stevens' descriptions of these spaces, their scale, their stone rings, their carved panels, combined with Catherwood's precisely rendered architectural drawings in the published volumes, created an image of Maya civilization as a lost world of monumental sophistication that captured the imagination of readers on both sides of the Atlantic and launched a wave of serious archaeological interest in Mesoamerican ruins that has never entirely subsided. Stevens himself had no means to interpret what he saw at the ball courts in full cultural context. The hieroglyphic texts that would eventually explain the game's cosmological dimensions were still decades away from decipherment. But his careful description of the physical evidence and his honest admission of uncertainty about its meaning established a standard of empirical observation and intellectual humility that the best subsequent Mesoamerican scholarship has tried to maintain. The German scholar Eduard Seller, who conducted extensive research in Mexico and Central America between the 1880s and 1910s, and whose prodigious comparative analysis of Mesoamerican art, iconography, calendrical systems, and religious texts constitutes one of the founding achievements of Mesoamerican studies as an academic discipline, was the first scholar to systematically articulate the ballgame's cosmological dimensions in a way that connected the physical evidence of the courts and the carved imagery of the equipment to the mythological narratives of the hero twins and the calendrical framework of the ritual calendar. Seller worked in an era before the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing, and some of his specific interpretations were consequently limited or mistaken in ways that subsequent scholarship has corrected. But his fundamental methodological contribution, his insistence that Mesoamerican cultural practices be understood as coherent intellectual systems embedded in a consistent cosmological framework rather than as arbitrary or irrational superstitions to be dismissed or explained away, transformed the entire field and made possible the deeper interpretations of ballgame culture that scholars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries have been able to achieve. The Mexican Revolution of 1910-1920 CE, devastating as it was in its direct human costs. The decade of civil conflict killed approximately 2 million people, roughly 8% of Mexico's total population, created the political and cultural conditions for a remarkable renaissance of indigenous cultural celebration and recovery. The post-revolutionary governments of the 1920s and 1930s, recognizing that a stable national identity was essential to political consolidation, and that the pre-Columbian past offered the most powerful available basis for such an identity, invested massively in museums, archaeological excavations, public art programs, and educational initiatives that placed the Aztec and Maya civilizations at the center of a heroic national narrative. Diego Rivera's great murals at the National Palace in Mexico City, painted between 1929 and 1951 CE, depict pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization with an artistic power and a historical seriousness that remains without equal in the public art of the 20th century. And the ballgame appears in these murals as a scene of athletic grandeur, spiritual depth, and civilizational achievement that demands to be recognized as equal in dignity and complexity to anything produced by the ancient civilizations of the Old World. Rivera's ballgame scenes, with their muscular players in elaborate equipment, their stone courts, their cosmic ball, gave millions of ordinary Mexicans a visual language for claiming their indigenous heritage with pride rather than shame. And this cultural function was as politically significant as any law or treaty. At El Tajin in Veracruz, a site of the Totonac culture, flourishing between approximately 600 and 900 CE, whose relationship to the classic Maya and to the ballgame tradition was deep and richly documented in its own extraordinary sculptural program. Systematic archaeological excavations beginning in the 1930s and continuing through the 20th century revealed 11 ball courts at the site, along with a series of carved stone panels of exceptional narrative completeness, depicting the preparation for, performance of, and ritual conclusion of ballgame ceremonies. The Tajin panels, carved in a distinctive style that combines intricate geometric interlace with dynamic figural narrative, constitute, perhaps, the most complete visual documentation of the ballgame ceremonial sequence in the entire archaeological record of Mesoamerica, and their systematic study in the mid-20th century contributed enormously to scholars' understanding of the game's ritual protocols. The equipment used in different phases of the ceremony and the specific iconographic conventions used to represent sacrifice, transformation, and cosmic renewal in the context of the ballgame. El Tajan itself was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1992 CE, and the ongoing excavation and conservation of its monuments continues to generate new insights into the ballgame tradition and its regional variations. The increasingly sophisticated archaeological and anthropological study of the ballgame through the mid-20th century was also producing something else, a growing awareness of the tension between the indigenista celebration of pre-Columbian culture and the honest scholarly reckoning with the specific historical realities of that culture, including the human sacrifice that the ballgame ritual in its most extreme forms involved. This tension between the political need for an uncomplicated, heroic indigenous past and the scholarly obligation to describe the past as it actually was not easily resolved, and the struggle to resolve it shaped the discourse around the ballgame and pre-Columbian history more broadly for decades. The sanitized version of the ballgame, the noble athletic competition with cosmological significance, but no actual blood, was politically useful but historically dishonest. The fully honest version, the game that culminated in decapitation, that was played by captives who had no choice in the matter, that was one component of a sacrificial economy involving tens of thousands of deaths per year across the Aztec Empire, was historically accurate but politically uncomfortable in the context of a nationalism that needed the pre-Columbian past as a source of uncomplicated pride rather than complex ambivalence. The resolution of this tension, when it came not from politics, but from scholarship, from the combined weight of new decipherments, new excavations, and new theoretical frameworks that made it possible to understand the ballgame's sacrificial dimensions not as a stain on an otherwise admirable civilization, but as an integral, coherent, philosophically serious component of a worldview that was trying, in its own terms, to do what all human worldviews try to do: make sense of life and death, maintain social order, and negotiate the terrifying uncertainty of a universe that does not always cooperate with human expectations. Then, from the combined tools of modern linguistic analysis, epigraphy, archaeology, and comparative anthropology, came the revolution in Maya studies that transformed our entire picture of Mesoamerican civilization and restored the ballgame's full, undiluted, deeply human complexity to the center of the story. Era 9, Modern Scholarship and the Living Game, 1950 CE, to present the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing, stands as one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, an accomplishment comparable in its intellectual significance to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics by Champollion in the 1820s, and the decipherment of Linear B Mycenaean Greek by Michael Ventris in the 1950s. And like both of those achievements, it required the creative insight of a researcher willing to challenge the established consensus of the scholarly community. Yuri Norzov, a Soviet linguist who had never visited a Maya archaeological site and who worked in conditions of wartime destruction and Stalinist intellectual repression that would have deterred anyone with a conventional academic career to protect, published his demonstration in 1952 that Maya hieroglyphic writing was a phonetic syllabic system, meaning that the signs represented sounds as well as meanings, and that the language they recorded could be read as spoken Mayan, rather than simply interpreted as a symbolic code. This finding, initially rejected with some hostility by the established scholars of Maya studies, who had built careers on the interpretation of Maya writing as a purely ideographic system of astronomical and calendrical notation, was eventually confirmed and extended by a generation of researchers working from the 1960s onward, including Michael Coe, David Kelly, Floyd Lounsbury, and ultimately the collaborative teams assembled at the famous Maya hieroglyph workshops organized by Linda Scheel at the University of Texas from the 1970s onward. By the 1980s, Maya texts were being read with sufficient fluency to begin constructing detailed dynastic histories of individual city-states, identifying specific rulers by name, establishing dates for specific events in their reigns, and reading the inscriptions, accounts of wars, alliances, marriages, accessions, deaths, and the ritual activities through which rulers maintained their divine authority. The ballgame appeared in these newly readable texts with great frequency as a political event, as a ritual obligation, as a mechanism for the demonstration of royal authority, and as a context for the sacrifice of war captives whose fate was sealed the moment they were captured and brought to the victor's ball court. The epigraphic evidence was unambiguous. Maya warfare was, in its primary stated purpose, not about territorial conquest or economic resources, but about the capture of enemy rulers and warriors for use as sacrificial ballgame players. And the texts recording these events described the capture with the same vocabulary of achievement and divine favor that records military victories in other ancient cultures. This was not savage barbarism. It was a coherent ritual economy operating within a fully developed cosmological framework, and understanding it as such was essential to understanding what the ballgame actually meant to the people who played it and watched it and bet on it and sometimes died in it. Linda Scheel and David Friedel's 1990 book, A Forest of Kings, the untold story of the ancient Maya, synthesized decades of decipherment work and presented its findings to a broad general audience with a narrative force and interpretive boldness that transformed public understanding of the Maya world. Schiele and Friedel argued that the ballgame was not peripheral to classic Maya political life, but absolutely central to it, that the capture, humiliation, and ritual sacrifice of enemy rulers on the ball court was the primary mechanism through which Maya kings demonstrated divine favor, validated their authority, and fulfilled their cosmic obligations to their own people and the supernatural powers that governed the universe. This argument was supported by textual evidence of extraordinary specificity. Inscriptions that named specific captured rulers, recorded the dates of their capture, and the specific ritual games at which they were sacrificed, and described the visual and ceremonial staging of their deaths with a precision that left no doubt about what was happening or why. The captured ruler kneeling in the ball court, forced to play the game in the costume of a defeated Xibalba lord, while his captor performed the role of the victorious hero twin, was participating in a cosmic drama that both participants understood with full theological fluency. The sacrifice was not gratuitous. It was the point. It was the whole point. Subsequent scholarship has extended and refined Schiele and Friedel's arguments in multiple directions, while maintaining the central insight about the ballgame's political and cosmological centrality. Bioarchaeological studies of skeletal remains from ball court contexts have begun to illuminate the physical realities of the game's practice in ways that complement the textual and iconographic evidence. Analysis of stress markers in the long bones and joints of individuals buried in ball court associated deposits at several sites has identified patterns of skeletal modification consistent with the specific physical demands of hip-strike ball playing, hypertrophy of the hip abductors and iliotibial band, stress remodeling in the femoral neck and greater trochanter, and characteristic wear patterns in the knee joint that correspond to the crouching, pivoting movements required to make hip-strike contact with a heavy ball under game conditions. These findings confirm that the game was practiced with sufficient regularity and intensity to leave permanent marks on the bodies of its players, and they demonstrate that the protective equipment depicted in the artistic record was necessary rather than merely ceremonial. The forces involved in the game were genuinely capable of causing serious injury, and the players who excelled at it did so through a combination of extraordinary natural athleticism and intensive physical training that transformed their bodies in ways that modern sports science can recognize and measure. The survival of living ballgame traditions in the modern period adds a dimension to the scholarly investigation that no amount of textual, artistic, or osteological evidence alone can provide. The phenomenological reality of the game as experienced by people who have grown up playing it, whose bodies have been trained by it, and who understand its physical logic from the inside rather than from the outside. The Ulama tradition of Sinaloa in northwestern Mexico, played today primarily in rural communities in the municipalities of Macorito, Cozalá, and several neighboring areas, is the most direct surviving descendant of the ancient Mesoamerican ballgame, maintaining with remarkable fidelity the core physical requirements of the pre-Columbian game. A solid rubber ball of great weight, struck exclusively with the hip, on a playing court defined by lines marked on the ground. The Ulama ball weighs between 6 and 9 pounds and has an extremely low bounce. It does not soar through the air like a basketball, but travels in low, fast arcs that require players to cover ground very quickly in order to make contact. The hip strike required to play Ulama successfully is a technique of extraordinary specificity. The player must position the side of the hip, specifically the area of the greater trochanter and the iliotibial band, to contact the ball as the body rotates laterally, generating force through the rotation of the trunk and pelvis rather than through the arm or foot. Learning to do this with the precision and power required to direct the ball accurately in a specific direction takes years of practice beginning in childhood, and the bruising that marks the hip of an Ulama player, a deep, spreading discoloration that experienced players display with the quiet pride of scar tissue, is a physical record of the thousands of impacts required to develop the technique to competitive level. The nearly total collapse of the Ulama tradition in the 20th century, driven by the disruption of traditional rural communities through industrialization, urban migration, and the economic marginalization of indigenous cultural practices, and its partial recovery in recent decades through the combined efforts of anthropological documentation, cultural preservation advocacy, and the autonomous decision of committed community practitioners to invest in transmission to younger generations, provides a case study in the dynamics of cultural survival that is both cautionary and ultimately hopeful. By the 1970s, the number of active Ulama players had declined to perhaps 2 or 3 dozen elderly men in a handful of Sinaloan communities, and there was serious reason to fear that the tradition would simply die with them, taking with it the last living connection to the physical knowledge accumulated over 4 millennia of continuous Mesoamerican ballgame practice. The fact that this did not happen, that Ulama is today practiced by several thousand people, that youth apprenticeship programs exist, that the game has attracted international attention and support from cultural heritage organizations, is a testament to the extraordinary persistence of cultural memory and the refusal of communities to surrender their connection to ancestral practices, even under conditions of severe historical and economic pressure. The digital revolution of the 21st century has added tools to ballgame research that would have been unimaginable to the scholars of even 2 generations ago. 3-dimensional laser scanning of ballcourt architecture at sites across Mesoamerica has revealed details of construction technique, spatial proportioning, and surface treatment that are invisible to the naked eye. Evidence of deliberate acoustic engineering in courts beyond Chichen Itza. Alignment features that connect specific courts to astronomical events, and construction sequence data that allows scholars to trace the architectural evolution of individual sites through multiple rebuilding phases with unprecedented precision. Chemical analysis of rubber artifacts from archaeological contexts, made possible by the development of mass spectrometry techniques capable of characterizing complex organic compounds in tiny samples of deteriorated material, has confirmed the geographic origins of rubber found at sites far from the Gulf Coast rubber-producing zone, and established trade routes and commercial connections between communities separated by hundreds of miles of terrain. And the computational tools of agent-based modeling and spatial analysis are beginning to allow researchers to simulate the social, economic, and environmental impacts of the ballgame complex on ancient Mesoamerican urban systems in ways that reveal the game's practical social functions, its roles in resource